The call came at 6:47 in the morning. I know the exact time because I was already awake, standing at the kitchen window with a cup of coffee going cold in my hand, watching the first snow of November settle over the backyard. My wife had picked out that window. She said she wanted to watch the seasons change from the kitchen. That was Margaret. She had been at St. Michael's for 11 days by then. Pancreatic cancer. The doctors had stopped using the word treatment about 3 weeks before that call. They'd started using words like comfort and process and time. You learn to hear what people aren't saying. The nurse on the phone was gentle. She said Margaret had passed quietly just before 6. She said she hadn't been in pain. I drove to the hospital alone. I signed the papers alone. I sat in a small room with a social worker who asked me if I had family nearby, and I said yes. I had 2 children. My son lived 40 minutes away in Mississauga. My daughter lived just over the bridge in Hamilton. I believed at that moment that I had family nearby. Margaret and I had been married for 38 years. We met at a community center dance in Burlington in 1986. She was there with her girlfriends. I was there because my buddy Ray dragged me out of the apartment after I'd spent 2 weeks moping over a girl who hadn't been worth the moping. Margaret laughed at something her friend said right as I walked past, and it was the kind of laugh that made you stop walking. Honest and unguarded. I introduced myself before I even had a plan. We had our son Ryan in 1991, our daughter Sylvie in 1994. We bought the house in Oakville in 1998, the one with the big kitchen window. Margaret planted a garden in the backyard every spring. She kept spreadsheets of what she'd planted where. She was an accountant. She organized everything. She organized our whole life. When she got the diagnosis in March, she didn't cry in the doctor's office. She asked questions. She wrote things down in a small notebook she kept in her purse. On the drive home, she held my hand across the center console and said quietly, "Okay, so we figure this out." We called both kids that evening. Ryan said he'd come over that weekend. Sylvie said she was sorry. That was a lot to take in. That she'd call us soon. Ryan came over that weekend. Sylvie called 2 weeks later. I'm not going to tell you I saw what was coming. I didn't. You build a picture of your children over 30 years and you trust that picture. You believe the people you raised are the people you know. The summer was hard in ways I don't have clean words for. Margaret had good weeks and bad weeks. The good weeks she'd sit in the garden and I'd bring her tea and she'd point at the tomatoes and tell me they were coming in crooked because I hadn't staked them right. The bad weeks, I slept in a chair by her bed because I couldn't be in the other room when she was struggling. Ryan visited maybe 4 times between March and September. He was busy. He had a new job, a promotion he was proud of. I understood that. I told myself I understood that. Sylvie visited twice. The second time, she sat in the living room with Margaret for about 40 minutes, and then she said she had to get back for something. I can't even remember what she said now. Something about a friend's birthday weekend up in Collingwood. She hugged her mother at the door. Margaret watched her walk to her car from the window. She didn't say anything about it. That was worse than if she had. In September, Margaret asked me to call a lawyer. Our friend Harold, who'd handled our will years ago. She said she wanted things updated. I made the call. Harold came to the house. They spoke privately for about an hour, while I made sandwiches in the kitchen that nobody ate. After Harold left, Margaret told me she'd made some changes. She said she wanted me to understand everything clearly before anything happened. She walked me through it. The house, the accounts, the RRSP she'd been building since she was 26 years old. She'd set up a structure she called the arrangement. She said she wanted things to be mine, plainly and legally mine, without complications. I asked her what she meant by complications. She looked at me for a moment, and then she said, "I know our children, Gordon." That was the first time I heard a door close. She declined fast in October. Hospice nurses came to the house for the first 2 weeks, and then we moved her to St. Michael's because the care she needed was beyond what I could manage alone. I stayed with her every day. I drove in from Oakville in the mornings, sat with her until evening. Sometimes she talked, Sometimes we'd just watch the television with the sound low. She liked those British baking programs. She found them soothing. Ryan came to the hospital once in October. He stayed for about 2 hours. He seemed uncomfortable in the way that some people are uncomfortable in hospitals, like the building itself was asking him something he didn't want to answer. He squeezed his mother's hand when he left. She watched him go. Sylvie didn't come to the hospital at all. She called me once in mid-October. She said she was having a hard time processing everything emotionally, and that she'd read somewhere about the importance of not forcing yourself into spaces that felt traumatic. She used the word space 4 times in that conversation. I was sitting in a hospital corridor when she called, eating a vending machine sandwich. I listened. I said I understood. I said her mother asked about her. She said she'd try to come when she felt more ready. She never came. When Margaret died on the 3rd of November, I called both of them from the hospital parking lot. I sat in my car in the dark and I made the calls. Brian answered on the 3rd ring. He was quiet for a moment, and then he said he was sorry, and that he'd come by in a day or 2. Sylvie didn't pick up, and I left a voicemail. She texted me back 40 minutes later. She said she was heartbroken and that she needed some time to grieve privately. The funeral was on the 7th, a Thursday. I had called both of them the week before to give them the details. Ryan said he'd be there. Sylvie said she'd be there. I had reserved seats in the front row. I had ordered flowers based on what Margaret would have wanted. Simple white roses and some greenery. Nothing fussy. I had written a eulogy that I practiced in the bathroom mirror twice. I was 63 years old, and I was practicing a speech about my wife to a bathroom mirror. 8 people came to that funeral. Harold came. Margaret's sister Diane flew in from Calgary and sat next to me and held my hand through the whole service. Our neighbors, the Kowalczyks from 2 doors down, came. Margaret's old book club friend Patricia came and cried quietly in the back row. 2 of her former colleagues came. That was 8, including me. Ryan had texted me that morning. He said something had come up at work, a crisis with a client account, that he was sorry, that he'd make it up to me. He said he'd come by the weekend. Sylvie didn't text at all. I found out later, much later, that she had gone to a yoga retreat up near Collingwood with some friends she'd met through a meditation studio she'd joined. A long weekend trip. She had apparently booked it 2 weeks before the funeral date. I stood at my wife's grave in Trafalgar Cemetery, with Diane on one side of me and Harold on the other, and the November wind was coming off the lake, and there were 8 people total in the world who came to say goodbye to Margaret. 38 years of her life in this country, in this city, in this house with me, and 8 people. I drove home that afternoon, and I sat at the kitchen table for a long time. The house was very quiet. I looked at her garden through the window. The tomato stakes were still there from summer. Crooked, just like she'd said. Harold called that evening to check on me. We talked for a while. He told me, carefully, that everything was in order. That the arrangement was solid. That I should take my time and not worry about anything for now. I thanked him. I meant it. Ryan came by on the Saturday as promised. He brought a grocery store fruit basket, the kind with the plastic wrap in the bow, the kind you bring to someone you don't know well. He sat at the kitchen table and we talked for about 20 minutes. He said he was sorry about the funeral. He said work had been brutal. He said his firm was going through a restructuring and the timing had been impossible. I nodded. I offered him coffee. Then, about 20 minutes in, he cleared his throat and said he wanted to talk about the house. He said he and his wife had been thinking, and that given what was happening in the market, it might be a smart time to discuss options. He used the word options. He said maybe a smaller place would be less burden for me, and that if the house went to market soon, they might be able to help me look for something in a less expensive neighborhood. He said we a lot. I noticed that. I told him I wasn't going anywhere. He shifted in his chair. He said he wasn't trying to pressure me, that he was just thinking about what was practical. He said Margaret would have wanted me to be practical. I said I was fairly confident about what Margaret would have wanted. He left shortly after that. He took the fruit basket with him, which I thought was an interesting choice. Sylvie showed up on the Monday. She was wearing exercise clothes, a matching set The kind you'd wear to a boutique fitness class in the distillery district. Her hair was down. She looked rested. She hugged me at the door for a long time. She cried a little. She said she was so sorry she hadn't been able to come to the funeral, that the grief had just been too overwhelming, that she needed to be somewhere she could process her feelings safely. She said the retreat had helped her come to peace with everything. I made tea. We sat at the kitchen table. She asked me how I was doing. I said I was managing. She asked about the financial situation, framed as concern. Was I going to be okay? Were there things she could help me understand? Had I talked to anyone about the accounts? I said Harold had taken care of everything. She asked what that meant exactly. I told her it meant everything was taken care of. She tried a few more angles. She mentioned that she knew Margaret had had a significant RRSP. She mentioned that she'd heard the house had been assessed recently. She mentioned that she and her partner were in a position where they could help manage things if I found it all overwhelming. I looked at her across the table. This was my daughter. I had taught her to ride a bike in the driveway of this house. I had driven her to piano lessons every Wednesday for 6 years. I had sat in a cold arena in January, watching her play ringette when she was 12, and the heat had gone out. I said, Sylvie, your mother left everything to me. All of it. The house, the accounts, everything. She updated everything in September, with Harold present. You and Ryan are not in the will. Not because she stopped loving you. She just stopped trusting you. Sylvie went very still. She said that wasn't possible. She said she was sure there had been a mistake. She said her mother wouldn't have done that. I told her I was confident her mother would have, and did. She got up from the table. Her hands were shaking a little. She said she'd need to see documentation. She said she'd want to speak with Harold directly. I told her she was welcome to call Harold. I gave her his number, which she already had, because she'd grown up in this house and Harold had been our lawyer since before she was born. She left without finishing her tea. Harold called me that evening to let me know that both Ryan and Sylvie had already been in touch with him separately, within hours of leaving my house. He said they'd both used the phrase undue influence. He said this was not unexpected, and that everything was in order to withstand exactly that kind of challenge. He said Margaret had been exceptionally thorough. I asked Harold if he'd seen this kind of thing before. He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, yes, more than I'd think. The legal challenge went nowhere. Margaret had documented everything clearly, signed everything in the presence of 2 witnesses, and had Harold certify her capacity at the time of signing. She had thought of everything. She always did. I didn't hear from either of my children for about 6 weeks after that. Then Ryan called, not to apologize exactly, but in that way people sometimes call where they're testing whether things can go back to normal without anyone having to say anything directly. He talked about Christmas. He talked about the kids, my grandchildren, 2 of them, 7 and 9 years old. He said they'd been asking about me. That part landed differently. The grandchildren. I told Ryan I was open to seeing the kids. I told him I loved his children and I wasn't going to make them pay for his choices. But I also told him that things had changed and that I needed him to understand what had actually happened. I said, your mother spent her last summer dying and you came to see her 4 times. You didn't come to her funeral because of a client account. And the first thing you did when you came to see me after she was buried was talk about selling the house. He was quiet for a long time. He said he hadn't handled things well. I said that was the most honest thing he'd said to me in months. We didn't fix everything that day. I don't think you fix something like that in a phone call. But something shifted. He came over for dinner a few weeks later. Just him, not his wife. We ate reheated pasta, and we talked for 3 hours. And some of it was hard, and some of it was just 2 people sitting at a kitchen table. He cried at one point, which I wasn't expecting. He said he'd been terrified of watching her die, and that he'd handled the fear badly, and he knew that was no excuse. I told him it wasn't an excuse. I also told him I understood fear. That I'd been afraid too, every single day, but that I'd been there anyway. Because that's what you do for the people you love. He nodded. He washed the dishes before he left. Sylvie and I haven't spoken since that Monday in November. She sent an email in January, formal and a little cold, saying she hoped I'd consider her position fairly. I wrote back and said I hoped she'd consider her mother's last months fairly. She didn't reply. Maybe she will eventually, maybe she won't. I planted the garden again in May. I followed Margaret's spreadsheets, the ones she'd kept on her laptop, every plant in its place. I staked the tomatoes properly this time. She would have had something to say about that, probably that it only took me 38 years and her dying to figure out the stakes. She was an accountant. She had a very precise sense of humor. Diane flew back out from Calgary in June, and we went to the cemetery together and left white roses, the same simple kind from the funeral. We sat on a bench nearby and talked for a long time about Margaret as a young woman, before I knew her. Before any of this. Diane said she used to drive their mother absolutely crazy because she was so relentlessly organized about everything. She said Margaret had kept a color-coded binder in her room at 14. That sounds exactly right. That sounds exactly like her. I'm 64 now. I have the house and the garden and a group of neighbors who check in on me more than I deserve. Harold comes for dinner sometimes. The grandchildren spent a weekend here in the summer, and I let them run in the backyard and didn't worry about the garden at all. The window still looks out over the yard, the way Margaret wanted it to. In the mornings, I stand there with my coffee, and I watch the light come across the grass, and sometimes I talk to her a little. I tell her the tomatoes came in straight this year. I tell her things are okay. I tell her she was right about the arrangement. She usually was. I've thought a lot about what Margaret said to me that afternoon in September, after Harold left and the sandwiches sat untouched on the counter. I know our children, Gordon. 6 words. She didn't say it with bitterness. She said it the way she said most true things, quietly, without fuss, like she was reading a number off a spreadsheet that simply was what it was. That's the part that stays with me, not the anger, not the legal letters, not Sylvie's email in January or Ryan's awkward fruit basket. What stays with me is that Margaret had already done the work of seeing clearly long before I was willing to. There's something I have come to understand about how life tends to settle accounts. Not in any mystical way. I'm too old and too Canadian for that kind of talk. I just mean that the way you treat people during the hard moments tends to come back around, one way or another, in the shape of who you become and what you're left with. Ryan spent a year avoiding his dying mother out of fear. And I think he knows now what that cost him. Not money, something harder to name. He washed the dishes the night he came for dinner, and I noticed that. Small things tell you a lot. Sylvie, I'm less sure about. She built herself a very comfortable story about emotional safety and personal processing, and stories like that can hold for a long time if no one challenges them. I'm not going to be the one to challenge it for her. That's her work to do. What I keep coming back to is this. The people who showed up at that funeral. Diane flying in from Calgary, Patricia from the book club, the Kowalczyks from 2 doors down. None of them were obligated. They came because they had built the kind of character that shows up. That's not a small thing. That's actually the whole thing. I think about what it takes to be that kind of person. It takes knowing what's right and doing it even when it's inconvenient, even when the hospital corridor smells like disinfectant and the chair is uncomfortable, and you'd rather be anywhere else. It takes being honest with yourself about your own fear. Because fear is real, I'm not dismissing it, and then choosing to act anyway. And it takes the patience to keep showing up across years and decades, not just in the moments that feel meaningful, but in the ordinary Wednesdays and the cold January arenas and the kitchen conversations that don't seem to matter until they're gone. Margaret had all of that. She had it in a way I spent 38 years admiring without fully understanding. She kept her spreadsheets and her garden records and her careful notebooks because she paid attention to things. She understood that the small, consistent choices are what build a life, and that a life built that way holds together when it needs to. I staked the tomatoes right this year. It's a small thing, but I think she'd have found that worth noting.